Hi, thanks for coming back to my little crafty secret. Today I will be sharing a process video on how to bind a quiet book. A full project share and a project share for each of the pages will be linked in the description box below. I decided to create this video because most of the videos I've seen on YouTube require either hand sewing or using a sewing machine. I don't know how to use a sewing machine and I didn't want to hand sew this book, but I do know how to use a hot glue gun. I needed to figure out a way to bind a quiet book using a hot glue gun. I decided to use a binding method that I use when making photo albums, and all I'm doing here is showing you what it looks like on a much larger scale. Here I'm showing you the cover page and the inner cover page. I took the two pages and sandwiched a binding strip in between. Same with the inner pages here. I have a binding strip and two pages that I sandwich the binding strip between. Again, I'm just showing the binding strip sandwiched between two pages. I'm very slow at showing this because I want to make sure that it's very clear in how it will eventually look like. Each of the pages that I have bound together with the binding strip in between, I will be calling them signatures. Now to attach each signature to each other, the binding strip has a little L shape or a dog leg, and I have them marked as spine in this video. What I did was just glue each of those L shapes together. Now that you see what it looks like assembled, I'm showing you now what it looks like prior to assembly. Of course, this is much different because this is paper and I will be binding felt. But what I'm doing is getting my two binding strips, I'm butting them together, and I will get one page and sandwich the binding strips in between, meaning that one page will go on one side of that binding strip and another page will go on the other side to make that sandwich. Again, I'm going slow here because I want to make sure that it's clear to you as a viewer on what I am doing. Throughout this video, I include the process for each step just for a few of the pages, but not for each page, only because this video would have been very long. Now you'll see how I attach each of the signatures together to create that spine. Again, I just take one page, attach it on one side of the binding strip, and take the other page and attach it at the other side of the binding strip. Then I take two signatures and I glue them on the binding strip to create a spine. And that's how I create each of the inner pages and also the inner cover and cover pages. Now the inner cover and cover pages are a little bit different. Rather than using two binding strips, I used only one binding strip. Attaching the inner cover page and the outer cover is very similar to attaching the inner pages to the binding strip. I'm going slow here again just to show you what it looks like to attach the cover and the inner cover together. Now I'm just giving one last final overview on what it will look like. Again, this is paper, so it's much different than binding felt. Now that I figured out how to bind the quiet book pages, I need to figure out how wide those binding strips need to be. In this case, I just decided to use 2-inch binding strips by however long the felt sheet was. I needed 12 binding strips, 10 for the inner pages and 2 for the inner cover and cover pages. All what I'm doing now here is just marking the felt with a pen so that I know where to cut the felt. Now that I have my binding strips cut, I take 2 of the binding strips and 2 of the pages. Because you can't fold felt like paper, I just took the binding strips and placed them inside the pages as you see here. Now I'm just hot gluing the binding strip to the page. I do this for both sides of the signature, and I believe I show this step about 2 to 3 times. As I do this step, I am very careful with where I'm gluing the binding strip to the page. You'll notice that I will take the previous page and place it on top of the page that I want to work with. I do this so that I know which direction the page should face and also what side the binding strip should be glued. Also, the light pink binding strips are shorter than the dark pink binding strips. And I want the light pink binding strips centered in the dark pink binding strips when I eventually glue them. This is the last page where I show that I'm gluing the binding strip to the page. Now I'm showing each of the pages with the binding strips attached. I'm now attaching each of the binding strips together. I do this by gluing the lighter pink on top of the darker pink binding strip. I will show this process one more time before moving on to the next step. Again, I'm just hot gluing the pink binding strip to the darker pink binding strip. Here's a look at the pages now bound together, creating each signature. Next, I need to attach the binding strip to the inner cover pages. I need to be very careful with where I place the binding strip because the inner cover pages are a little bit different than the inner pages. To figure out where the binding strip should go, I use the other signatures to help me figure out how the book should flip through. And of course, once I figure this out, I am just hot gluing the binding strip to the page. Now I'm just doing the same thing for the front inner cover page, now for the back inner cover page. Here's a quick flip through of the quiet book. Most of the pages are now bound together. The only pages that are not bound are the inner cover pages and the very first page and the very last page. And that's just because they are a little bit different than binding the inner pages. Now I'm just showing how I'm binding the very first page, inside page of the quiet book together with the signature. All I'm doing is just hot gluing that first page down. Now that the pages are bound into signatures, I need to bind the signatures together. I do this by hot gluing the light pink binding strip to the other light pink binding strip. I'll show that step once more. I'm just hot gluing the dark pink binding strip to the other dark pink binding strip. I realized I didn't hot glue the very last page to a signature, so that's all I'm doing here, just gluing the very last page to the last signature. Now I'm able to hot glue the inner cover pages to the bounded signatures. But before that, I decided to hot glue the inner pages together. I decided to hot glue two sides, the two very short sides, and leaving the long side open. I did this because I decided that it might be a good idea to have a pocket for each of the pages in case I decide to create more items that my daughter can play with. I won't show every single page being glued, but I definitely glued each page before moving on to the next step. Now I'm able to bind the two inner cover pages to the bounded signatures. Again, I'm just being very careful with the orientation of the page, making sure that I'm binding it correctly. Now I'm able to bind the last inner cover page. At this point, I am quite pleased with how it's turning out. Now I'm at the very last step here. I am just going to bind the signatures to a cover, and right now I am fiddling with the spine. And I actually decided to do the spine like this. I had a different way of, or different thought of how I was going to bind the signatures to the spine. I thought I was going to do it more like a photo album, but because this is felt, it didn't. The binding strips did not lay as flat as I had hoped. For the spine, I decided to have two felt sheets so that it's thicker, so that I can have a reinforcement for the eyelet. And I'm just now gluing the two felt sheets together before installing the eyelet. To find the middle of the spine, I just folded it in half, and to find or to know where I should put the eyelet, I used the split ring to measure how far down I should have the eyelet. Now I'm just adding a tassel to the split ring, and I used my jewelry making pliers to open up the jump rings and install a chain and the tassel. There are other things too that I could include on this, but for right now it was just the tassel. So now I'm just adding a scrap piece of ribbon to the split ring. It is actually too long, so I decided just to cut it in half and add it to the split ring. So now I'm able to add the two cover pages to the bounded signatures, but before I do that, I am adding the title of the book to the cover page. While I wait for my iron to heat up, I am going to bind the spine to the bounded signatures. To do this, you'll see that I am adding hot glue to the outer binding strips. My iron is now hot, so I'm able to add the vinyl to the cover. I hot glue at the edges first rather than at the spine because I want the edges to match. I do this for both the front cover and the back cover. I really like the way this came out, and I hope you do too. And this is actually a much easier method than having to sew the book together. Although it does look very nice sewn, I didn't have the time to actually sew it, and again, I don't know how to use a sewing machine, and I didn't want to hand sew all these pages. Here's just a quick flip through. If you like this project, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Please also look in the description box below to see detailed project shares of each of the pages. Thanks until next time.